My brother broke the law in the worst way. The district attorney refuses to press charges. The detective sat across from me in the hospital cafeteria and explained why my brother wouldn't be arrested for what he'd done to Amanda Cortez. Detective Rachel Winters had been investigating for 3 weeks, compiling witness statements, medical records, and security footage showing my brother Keith leaving Amanda's apartment at 2:47 a.m. on October 8th. Amanda had been found 6 hours later by her roommate, unconscious on her bathroom floor with a skull fracture, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. She'd been in a medically induced coma for 11 days. The evidence pointed clearly at Keith, a senior prosecutor in the district attorney's office who'd been dating Amanda for 4 months. But District Attorney Leonard Voss had personally intervened, Winters explained, ordering her to close the case without filing charges. She'd written her report 3 times, each version sent back with instructions to find alternative explanations. Voss claimed insufficient evidence despite security footage, the 911 call Amanda made before losing consciousness where she named Keith, and DNA evidence under her fingernails. Winters looked exhausted and angry. She'd been a detective for 19 years and said this was the most clear-cut domestic violence case she'd ever seen buried by her own office. She'd requested this meeting because she wanted someone in Keith's family to know the truth before it disappeared completely. She said Amanda deserved that much. I sat there holding my coffee cup so tightly my knuckles went white, trying to process what I was hearing. My brother Keith was 42, Harvard Law School, decorated prosecutor with a conviction rate that made his career. He'd put away murderers, rapists, organized crime figures. The idea that he'd beaten his girlfriend nearly to death seemed impossible. But Winters showed me the medical examiner's photographs on her phone, and I had to turn away. Amanda's face was unrecognizable, swollen and discolored, her left eye socket fractured. Winters said the injuries were consistent with sustained assault, multiple impacts over at least 20 minutes. Someone had done this methodically, not in a moment of rage. Amanda had fought back based on defensive wounds on her arms and the tissue under her nails, but she'd been overpowered. The security camera in her apartment building's lobby showed Keith entering at 11:53 p.m. and leaving at 2:47 a.m., his shirt untucked and face scratched. Winters had interviewed him once before Voss shut down the investigation. Keith claimed he'd left Amanda's apartment at midnight after an argument about their relationship. He said she'd been fine when he left, upset but uninjured. He had no explanation for the security footage showing him leaving hours later, or the scratches on his face, except to say he must have been mistaken about the time. His alibi for the hours in between was that he'd driven around thinking. No witnesses, no credit card receipts, no GPS data, because he'd turned off his phone. Winters said it was the weakest alibi she'd ever heard, but it didn't matter, because Voss wouldn't let her pursue it. I asked why Voss was protecting Keith, and Winters said that was the question that had been keeping her awake for 3 weeks. She'd worked dozens of cases with Keith as the prosecutor and knew he was Voss's protege. Voss had personally recruited Keith from the Manhattan DA's office 5 years ago, promising him a fast track to a judgeship. They had weekly strategy meetings, attended conferences together, and Voss had publicly stated that Keith would be his successor when he retired. That relationship created a massive conflict of interest, but Voss refused to recuse himself. When Winters had suggested bringing in the state attorney general's office, Voss had threatened her with insubordination charges. She'd contacted Internal Affairs, but they reported directly to Voss. She'd reached out to the state police, but without the DA filing charges, they had no jurisdiction. She was trapped in a system designed to protect its own. Winters said she was telling me this because she'd exhausted official channels. She couldn't go to the press without losing her job and pension, and she had 3 kids in college. But she thought if someone outside the system knew the truth, maybe they could find another way. She slid a flash drive across the table and said it contained copies of everything she'd compiled before being ordered to destroy her case files. She'd made the copies at home on her personal computer, which meant she'd violated department policy and could be prosecuted for it. But she said some rules were worth breaking. Then she stood up, wished me luck, and walked away. I sat there staring at the flash drive for 10 minutes, my coffee going cold while cafeteria workers wiped down tables around me. My phone buzzed with a text from Keith asking if I wanted to grab dinner Thursday. He'd been texting me regularly since Amanda's hospitalization, talking about work stress and a difficult case he was prosecuting. Not once had he mentioned Amanda or the fact that his girlfriend was in ICU fighting for her life. That absence now felt deliberately calculated. I'd been to family dinners where Keith had bragged about his conviction rate, his ability to read juries, his talent for finding weaknesses in defense arguments. He was methodical and strategic in everything he did. If he'd heard Amanda, he would have planned his cover story carefully. I pocketed the flash drive and went up to the ICU, where Amanda had been transferred 3 days ago after they'd brought her out of the coma. Her roommate, Melissa Strand, was sitting in the waiting room and recognized me from the one time Keith had brought Amanda to a family barbecue. She looked relieved to see someone connected to Keith and asked if I knew when he was coming to visit. I said I didn't know and asked how Amanda was doing. Melissa said the doctors were cautiously optimistic, but Amanda couldn't remember what happened. The last thing she recalled was making dinner around 7 that evening. Everything after that was gone, wiped out by the head trauma. She didn't remember calling 911 or naming Keith before she lost consciousness. The retrograde amnesia might be permanent, according to her neurologist. Melissa said she'd tried calling Keith repeatedly to update him on Amanda's condition, but he hadn't returned her calls. She thought maybe he was too devastated to face seeing Amanda in this condition. She described how close they'd seemed, how Keith had talked about proposing, how Amanda had been happier than Melissa had ever seen her. Then something had shifted about a month before the assault. Amanda had become withdrawn and anxious. She'd stopped talking about Keith in their usual way. Melissa had asked if everything was okay, and Amanda had changed the subject. 2 weeks before the assault, Melissa had heard them arguing through Amanda's bedroom door. Keith's voice had been cold and controlled while Amanda cried. Melissa couldn't make out words, but the tone had frightened her. She'd asked Amanda about it the next morning, and Amanda had said they were working through some issues, that Keith had strong opinions about how she should handle her career and social life. Melissa said she'd gotten a bad feeling but hadn't pushed because Amanda seemed embarrassed. Now Melissa blamed herself for not intervening. I asked what kind of opinions Keith had expressed, and Melissa said Amanda had mentioned he didn't want her going out with coworkers for drinks, that he thought her friend group was immature, that he'd criticized her clothing choices as too attention-seeking. Amanda had started declining invitations and dressing more conservatively. Melissa had noticed, but rationalized it as Amanda being in love and prioritizing her relationship. She started crying and said she should have recognized the warning signs. I told her it wasn't her fault and asked if she'd told any of this to Detective Winters. Melissa said Winters had interviewed her twice, taking detailed notes about Keith and Amanda's relationship. Then suddenly Winters had called to say the investigation was closed due to lack of evidence. Melissa had been stunned. She'd offered to provide more information, to testify, whatever was needed. Winters had sounded angry, but said there was nothing more she could do. I went home and plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The files were organized meticulously. Crime scene photos, medical reports, witness statements, security footage, phone records, and Winters' own investigative summary. I spent 4 hours reading through everything and felt sicker with each document. The evidence was overwhelming. Amanda's 911 call had been transcribed. She'd said, "Keith hurt me. He wouldn't stop. I think my head is bleeding. Please help." The call had lasted 16 seconds before going silent. Paramedics had found her phone on the bathroom floor next to her body. The medical report detailed injuries consistent with being punched, kicked, and having her head slammed against hard surfaces. The bathroom tiles had been cracked where her skull had impacted. Blood spatter analysis showed she'd been beaten in multiple locations throughout the apartment, suggesting she'd tried to escape and been dragged back. Keith's DNA was under her fingernails. His fingerprints were on her throat in a pattern indicating strangulation. A neighbor in the apartment below had called building security at 1:30 a.m. to complain about loud thuds and a woman screaming. Security had knocked on Amanda's door, but gotten no response. They'd noted it in their log, but hadn't called police. The security footage showed Keith leaving the building at 2:47 a.m. His clothes were disheveled, his face had visible scratches, and he was carrying his suit jacket instead of wearing it. He'd walked to his car parked 2 blocks away, gotten in, and driven away. Traffic cameras had tracked his vehicle to his house in the suburbs, arriving at 3:12 a.m. His neighbor's security camera showed him entering his house at 3:15 a.m. He'd gone to work the next morning at his usual time, 8:30 a.m., wearing a different suit and covering the scratches on his face with makeup according to his secretary's statement. When news of Amanda's hospitalization had reached his office around noon, Keith had expressed shock and concern. He'd told colleagues they'd broken up amicably 2 weeks prior, and he hadn't seen her since. That was a lie. His credit card records showed he'd bought dinner for 2 at Amanda's favorite restaurant the night before the assault. A waiter had given a statement saying they'd seemed tense, that Keith had done most of the talking while Amanda had looked uncomfortable. They'd left separately after Keith had paid. The waiter remembered because it had struck him as odd that they'd arrived together, but departed apart. Winters' summary concluded that Keith had assaulted Amanda in a sustained attack, lasting approximately 3 hours, that he'd attempted to strangle her based on bruising patterns, that he'd caused traumatic brain injury by repeatedly striking her head against hard surfaces, and that he'd fled the scene, knowing she was gravely injured. The recommended charges were attempted murder, aggravated assault, and strangulation. Winters had attached a memo documenting her 3 meetings with D.A. Voss, where he'd rejected her evidence. In the first meeting, Voss had claimed the security footage timestamp could be wrong. In the second, he'd suggested Amanda might have fallen and injured herself after Keith left, that her 911 call was confused due to head trauma. In the third meeting, he'd ordered Winters to close the case, and told her that pursuing charges against Keith would damage the office's credibility and her own career. Winters had documented that she'd raised the conflict of interest and been told she was overstepping. The memo was dated 4 days ago. She'd been taken off all active cases yesterday and reassigned to cold case review, which Winters noted was effectively a demotion designed to silence her. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark trying to figure out what to do with this information. My brother had nearly killed someone and was being protected by the most powerful legal figure in the county. Going to the police was pointless since they reported to Voss. The state attorney general's office would need a formal complaint and evidence, but Winters' files were obtained illegally. Using them could get her prosecuted and might not even result in charges against Keith. The media was an option, but without Amanda's cooperation and with her memory loss, Keith's lawyers would destroy her credibility. They'd claim she was confused, that she'd fallen, that she was making false accusations. Keith knew exactly how to dismantle a victim's testimony. He'd done it dozens of times in court. I thought about confronting Keith directly, but realized that would only alert him that someone was investigating. He'd lawyer up and the evidence might disappear. Voss clearly had the power to make files vanish. I needed to be smarter than both of them. I needed leverage they couldn't ignore and a platform they couldn't control. I spent that night researching, making notes, planning. By sunrise, I had the outline of a strategy that was probably illegal, definitely risky, but might be the only way to get justice for Amanda. The first step was talking to Amanda herself. I went back to the hospital the next morning and asked Melissa if I could see her. Melissa said Amanda was awake, but confused about why Keith hadn't visited. The doctors had told her about her injuries, but she couldn't remember how they'd happened. She thought maybe she'd been in an accident. No one had told her that Keith was suspected because technically he wasn't. The investigation had been closed. I asked Melissa not to mention my relationship to Keith and went into Amanda's room. She was sitting up in bed, her face still swollen and discolored, her left arm in a cast. She looked small and broken. When I introduced myself as a friend of a friend checking in, she smiled weakly and thanked me for coming. I asked how she was feeling and she said physically terrible but more confused than anything. She couldn't remember the night she was hurt. The doctor said that might be permanent. She'd been trying to piece together what happened, but had gaps. She remembered making pasta for dinner. She remembered Keith texting that he was coming over. Then nothing until waking up in the hospital 11 days later. I asked about her relationship with Keith, and her expression shifted. She said things had been complicated lately. Keith had been wonderful at first, attentive and romantic and supportive of her career as a graphic designer. But after about 2 months, he'd started expressing concerns about her choices. Who she spent time with, what she wore, how she managed her money. She'd thought he was just being protective. Then the criticism had increased. He'd told her that her friends were bad influences, that her clothing was inappropriate, that she was too friendly with male colleagues. He'd wanted her to check in with him throughout the day and got angry if she didn't respond to texts immediately. She'd started to feel suffocated but told herself he was just intense because he cared. The night before she was hospitalized, they'd had dinner and he'd told her he'd looked through her phone while she was in the shower. He'd found text messages with a male coworker that he considered too familiar. She tried to explain that Dylan was gay and engaged, that they were just friends, but Keith had been furious. He'd accused her of lying and disrespecting him. She told him she needed space, and he'd left the restaurant angry. She remembered him texting later asking to come over to talk. She'd agreed because she thought they could work it out. After that, her memory was blank. I asked if Keith had ever hurt her before, and she hesitated. Then she said he'd grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise during an argument a month ago. He'd apologized immediately and said he'd never do it again. She'd believed him because she'd never seen that side of him in their previous 3 months together. She'd made excuses about the stress of his job. I asked if she thought Keith might have hurt her the night she was hospitalized, and she went silent for a long time. Finally, she said she didn't want to believe that, but she'd been having flashes of memory that didn't make sense. Fragments of being scared, of pain, of Keith's face close to hers. The doctor said traumatic memories sometimes came back in pieces. She'd been afraid to examine those fragments too closely because of what they might mean. She asked if I knew something she didn't, and I told her about Detective Winters' investigation and Voss shutting it down. I told her about the security footage, the 911 call, the evidence that Keith had beaten her. She started crying silently, tears running down her damaged face. She said she'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed was different. She asked why no one had told her, and I explained that without her memory, she wasn't considered a reliable witness. Without the DA filing charges, there was no case. She asked what happened now, and I told her I had a plan, but it would require her participation, and it might get ugly. Keith would hire expensive lawyers who would attack her credibility. The DA's office would claim she was confused or vindictive. The process could take months or years and might not succeed. But doing nothing meant Keith would face no consequences and would likely hurt someone else. Amanda wiped her eyes and said she wanted to know the plan. I explained that I'd been researching federal options. Domestic violence resulting in severe injury could be prosecuted federally under certain circumstances, particularly if there was evidence of local corruption preventing state prosecution. The FBI had jurisdiction over civil rights violations, which included law enforcement officials obstructing justice. If we could document Voss's interference in the investigation and present it alongside the evidence of Keith's assault, the FBI might take the case, but we'd need more than Winters' illegally copied files. We'd need testimony from other victims. I'd found 3 women who dated Keith before Amanda. 2 had restraining orders against him. 1 had filed an assault complaint that was never prosecuted. If they'd testify about a pattern of abuse, and if we could show that Keith's position in the DA's office had protected him, we might have a federal case. Amanda said she'd do whatever was necessary. She asked if I'd contacted the other women, and I said not yet. I'd wanted her permission first. She gave it immediately. Then she asked why I was helping her when Keith was my brother. I said I'd spent my whole life believing Keith was a good person who prosecuted bad people. Finding out he was the bad person he'd spent his career prosecuting had destroyed that belief. I couldn't let him hurt anyone else. I couldn't be complicit in his crimes by staying silent. She reached out with her uninjured hand and squeezed mine. She said she was sorry I had to learn this about my brother. I told her I was sorry I hadn't learned it sooner, before he'd put her in the hospital. We sat there for a moment, two people connected by Keith's violence, forming an alliance neither of us had wanted. Then I left to start tracking down Keith's previous victims. The first was Alicia Grant, who dated Keith 3 years ago. I found her through public records showing her restraining order filing. She lived 2 hours away and worked as a veterinary technician. When I called and explained who I was and why I was reaching out, she went silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said she'd wondered when someone would finally care about what Keith had done to her. We met at a coffee shop near her workplace. Alicia was 31, with short dark hair and careful eyes that assessed me before she sat down. She said she'd dated Keith for 5 months, and it had been the worst experience of her life. He'd been charming initially, successful and confident and attentive. Then gradually, he'd become controlling. He'd monitored her phone, shown up at her work unannounced, and criticized everything about her life. When she'd tried to end the relationship, he'd exploded. He'd come to her apartment drunk and tried to force his way inside. She'd called the police, and he'd been arrested. But by morning, he'd been released, and the charges had been dropped. The officer who'd arrested him had apologized to Keith and told Alicia she should be more careful about crying wolf. She'd been terrified and had filed for a restraining order the next day. The judge had granted it, and Keith had complied by staying away, but he'd sent her flowers at work with notes saying he missed her and hoped she'd reconsider. The notes had seemed romantic to her coworkers, but felt threatening to Alicia. She'd kept them all in case she needed evidence. After 6 months, the notes had stopped, and she'd thought she was safe. Then, she'd seen his name in the paper, prosecuting a domestic violence case, and felt sick. She said she'd thought about coming forward then, but was scared. Keith knew where she worked, where she lived, what car she drove. He had connections throughout law enforcement. She'd moved on with her life and tried to forget. But she'd never forgotten. She'd dated cautiously since then, ending things at the first sign of controlling behavior. Keith had damaged her ability to trust. When I told her about Amanda and showed her the medical photos on my phone, she went pale. She said she'd always feared Keith would seriously hurt someone. She'd felt guilty for not preventing it by speaking up. I told her that wasn't her fault, that the system had failed by not taking her complaint seriously. I asked if she'd be willing to give a statement to federal investigators if I could get them involved. She said yes immediately. She'd testify in court if necessary. She wanted Keith held accountable for what he'd done to her and to Amanda. I gave her my contact information and promised to keep her updated. Then I went looking for the second victim, Nina Caldwell. She'd dated Keith 4 years ago and had filed an assault complaint that went nowhere. Finding her was harder because she'd moved out of state. I finally tracked her down in Colorado, where she worked as a high school teacher. When I called, she asked how I'd found her, and I explained I was Keith's brother investigating allegations against him. She laughed bitterly and said good luck with that. The system protected its own. I told her about Amanda and Alicia, and that I was building a federal case. Nina went quiet, then said she'd been waiting for this call for 4 years. She told me Keith had strangled her during an argument in his car. They'd been dating for 3 months, and she'd told him she wanted to slow things down. He'd driven to a secluded area, and when she tried to get out of the car, he'd grabbed her by the throat and squeezed until she'd lost consciousness. She'd woken up alone in the car with bruises on her neck and Keith's business card on the dashboard with a note saying, "Don't make me do that again." She'd gone straight to the police and filed a report. The officer had taken her statement and photos of her injuries. Then Keith had shown up at the station with his boss, DA Leonard Voss, who'd vouched for Keith's character and suggested Nina was emotionally unstable. Voss had produced text messages where Nina had said she loved Keith and wanted to be with him forever. The messages had been taken out of context, but made her look obsessed. The officer had declined to forward the case for prosecution, suggesting Nina and Keith had a volatile relationship, and she should just move on. Nina had been so traumatized that she'd quit her job, broken her lease, and moved to Colorado to start over. She'd never told anyone except her therapist what had happened. She'd been too ashamed and scared. She asked if I really thought a federal case would work, and I said I didn't know, but it was the only option that bypassed Voss's control. She said she'd testify if it helped put Keith in prison where he belonged. She'd taken a personal day tomorrow and could fly out for an interview if I needed her to. I said I'd arrange it once I had a federal agent willing to listen. The third victim had been harder to find because she hadn't filed any police reports. But Winter's files had included a note about a woman named Simone Harper who'd contacted the DA's office 2 years ago with allegations against Keith. The complaint had been dismissed without investigation. I found Simone through social media. She worked in finance and lived in the city. When I messaged her explaining who I was, she responded immediately asking if Keith had hurt someone else. I called her and she said she'd been expecting this for 2 years. She told me Keith had assaulted her after she'd broken up with him. They'd dated for 4 months, and she'd ended it because of his controlling behavior and jealous rages. A week after the breakup, he'd cornered her in her office building's parking garage. He'd pushed her against a car and put his hand over her mouth when she'd tried to scream. He'd told her that she belonged to him, and no one left him unless he decided it was over. Then, he'd forced himself on her. She'd been too terrified to fight back. Afterward, he'd straightened his tie and walked away. She'd reported it to the DA's office the next day, thinking they'd taken assault by one of their own prosecutors seriously. Instead, an assistant DA had interviewed her and suggested she was bitter about the breakup. The assistant had implied that consensual sex followed by regret wasn't the same as assault. Simone had tried to escalate the complaint, but had been told it wouldn't be pursued. She'd consulted a lawyer about suing Keith civilly, but the lawyer had said cases against prosecutors were nearly impossible to win. They had immunity for actions taken as part of their jobs, and even for personal conduct, juries tended to side with law enforcement. The lawyer had recommended she drop it and focus on moving forward. Simone had felt helpless and violated twice, once by Keith, and again by the system. She'd changed jobs to avoid seeing Keith at professional events, and had moved to a building with better security. She'd spent 2 years looking over her shoulder. Now she said she wanted to help destroy him. She'd give statements, testify, provide whatever evidence I needed. She still had the clothes she'd been wearing that day, never dry cleaned because some part of her had known she might need them. I told her to keep those clothes secured and that I'd be in touch soon. With 3 previous victims willing to testify and Amanda's case documented, I had the foundation for a pattern of abuse argument. But I still needed a way to get federal attention. The FBI didn't typically take domestic violence cases unless there were compelling circumstances. I needed to make this case about corruption, not just assault. That meant documenting Voss's obstruction in detail. I went back to Detective Winters and asked if she'd be willing to testify about Voss shutting down her investigation. We met at the same hospital cafeteria, and she said she'd already been thinking about it. She'd been a cop for 19 years and had never violated protocol or leaked case information. But the last 3 weeks had made her realize that following the rules meant letting Keith walk free while Amanda suffered. She'd testify about Voss's interference, about being ordered to close the case despite overwhelming evidence, about being threatened with insubordination and then demoted when she'd pushed back. She'd lose her job and probably her pension, but she had documentation of everything, and her lawyer thought she could fight the termination. More importantly, she couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent. She asked what my plan was, and I told her I was going to contact the FBI field office and request a meeting about public corruption and civil rights violations by local law enforcement. I'd present the evidence of Keith's assaults, the documentation of Voss's obstruction, and the testimony of 4 victims spanning 4 years. If the FBI opened an investigation, they'd have jurisdiction over both Keith's crimes and Voss's corruption. Winters said it was a long shot but worth trying. She gave me the name of an agent she'd worked with on a task force years ago, someone she trusted to at least listen. I called FBI Special Agent Denise Blackwood that afternoon and explained I had evidence of a prosecutor committing multiple assaults and the district attorney obstructing investigation into those crimes. She was skeptical until I mentioned Keith's name. Then her tone changed. She said she'd heard rumors about Keith from other law enforcement, but nothing concrete. She'd meet with me the next day. I spent that evening organizing everything onto a new flash drive, separate from Winters' files. I included witness statements from the 3 previous victims, Amanda's medical records, and 911 call transcript, security footage, and Winters' documentation of Voss's obstruction. I wrote a timeline showing Keith's pattern of escalating violence over 4 years, and how each incident had been buried by the DA's office. By the time I finished, it was after midnight, and I felt exhausted and wired at the same time. I hadn't talked to Keith since receiving Winters' evidence. He'd texted me twice, asking about dinner and once asking if I wanted to watch the football game this weekend. Normal brother stuff. Seeing his name on my phone made me feel sick. This was the person I'd looked up to my whole life. Keith was 8 years older and had been my hero growing up. He'd helped me with homework, taught me to drive, wrote my college recommendation letter. He'd been the golden child who could do no wrong, Harvard-educated, successful career, respected by everyone. Finding out he was a monster had broken something in me that wouldn't heal. I thought about responding to his texts with everything I knew, confronting him with the evidence and demanding he confess, but that would only give him time to prepare his defense and warn Voss. I needed the FBI to move fast before Keith knew what was coming. So I didn't respond. I let his texts sit unanswered and focused on building the case against him. The meeting with Agent Blackwood took place at the FBI field office. She'd brought another agent, Thomas Reeves, who specialized in public corruption. They listened while I walked them through the timeline, showed them the evidence, and explained how Voss had shut down Winters' investigation. Blackwood took detailed notes, while Reeves asked pointed questions about chain of custody and how I'd obtained certain documents. I admitted that some evidence had been copied illegally by Detective Winters and that using it might create legal issues. Reeves said that wasn't ideal, But if the evidence was credible and could be corroborated through legal channels, they could potentially pursue parallel construction. They'd develop their own evidence trail that led to the same conclusions without relying on tainted sources. Blackwood asked if the victims would testify, and I said all four had agreed. She asked if I understood that building a federal case would take months and that Keith would hire the best defense attorneys money could buy. I said I understood. She asked why I was doing this when Keith was my brother, and I told her the same thing I'd told Amanda. I couldn't let him hurt anyone else. I couldn't be complicit by staying silent. Family loyalty didn't extend to protecting abusers. Blackwood studied me for a moment, then said they'd open a preliminary investigation. They'd interview the victims, review the evidence independently, and determine if there was sufficient basis for federal charges. If they moved forward, they'd need to coordinate with the Department of Justice because prosecuting a sitting prosecutor was politically sensitive. It could take 6 months to a year before any charges were filed. In the meantime, I should not contact Keith or Voss or do anything that might alert them to the investigation. I agreed and left feeling like I'd done what I could. The rest was out of my hands, but I'd underestimated how quickly Keith would figure out something was wrong. 3 days after my FBI meeting, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door and found him standing there in his suit, looking polished and professional. He said he'd been worried because I hadn't returned his calls. He asked if everything was okay between us. I said everything was fine. I'd just been busy with work. He stepped inside without being invited and looked around my apartment. His eyes landed on my laptop and the notepad where I'd been organizing information. I'd been careful not to leave anything visible, but Keith had always been observant. He asked what I was working on, and I said a project for my job as an accountant. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. Then he said he'd heard that someone had been asking questions about him around town, talking to people he used to date. He wondered if I knew anything about that. I kept my expression neutral and said I didn't. He watched me closely, and I could see him analyzing my response, looking for tells the way he did with witnesses in court. Finally, he smiled and said he must be paranoid. Work stress was getting to him. He'd been prosecuting a complex fraud case, and it had him on edge. He asked if I wanted to grab dinner next week, and I said sure. I'd check my schedule. He left, and I immediately called Agent Blackwood to report the visit. She said they'd been conducting interviews, and Keith must have heard about it through his network. She told me to be careful and not to meet with Keith alone. If he contacted me again, I should record the conversation if possible. The next 2 months were tense. The FBI interviewed all 4 victims, Detective Winters, Amanda's roommate Melissa, and several other people connected to Keith's history. They subpoenaed phone records, financial documents, and security footage through legal channels. They interviewed employees at the DA's office who confirmed that Voss and Keith were extremely close and that Voss had shut down complaints against Keith in the past. One paralegal came forward to say she'd witnessed Voss destroying a file related to Keith 2 years ago. Another assistant DA said Voss had told the office that anyone who cooperated with investigations into Keith would find their careers over. The FBI investigation expanded to include not just Keith's assaults, but Voss's pattern of obstructing justice to protect him. During this time, Keith called me repeatedly. I let most calls go to voicemail. When I did answer, he'd ask probing questions about what I'd been doing, who I'd been talking to, whether I'd heard any rumors about him. I kept my answers vague and short. Then Amanda's memory started returning. The neurologist said it was unusual, but sometimes traumatic memories resurface months after injury. Amanda called me crying and said she'd remembered everything. Keith coming to her apartment angry, accusing her of cheating, grabbing her when she'd tried to leave. She remembered him hitting her, the pain exploding across her face, falling and trying to crawl away. She remembered him dragging her back by her hair, slamming her head against the bathroom floor repeatedly while she begged him to stop. She remembered calling 911 while he was in her bedroom, hearing him come back, dropping the phone as he lunged at her, then nothing until the hospital. The memories had come back all at once during a therapy session and left her shaking and terrified, but they also gave her something she'd been missing: certainty. She knew exactly what Keith had done, and she was ready to face him in court. I told her about the FBI investigation, and she said she'd already been interviewed twice. Agent Blackwood had told her they were building a strong case, but warned it would be a long process. Amanda said she didn't care how long it took. She wanted justice. She'd started a blog documenting her recovery and speaking about domestic violence. She didn't name Keith yet, but wrote about her experiences with controlling relationships and the trauma of surviving assault. The blog had gained followers and media attention. Local reporters had started asking questions about her case and why no charges had been filed. The pressure on Voss increased when a newspaper ran an investigative piece about assault complaints against prosecutors in his office that had been dismissed without investigation. The article didn't name Keith specifically, but detailed 3 cases over 4 years where women had accused DA's office employees of violence and had their complaints buried. The article quoted anonymous sources saying Voss protected his staff from accountability. The State Bar Association announced they were opening an ethics investigation into Voss's handling of complaints. Then the State Attorney General's office launched their own review of closed cases in Voss's jurisdiction. The walls were closing in, but Keith still walked free. He'd hired a high-profile defense attorney even though he hadn't been charged with anything. The attorney released a statement saying Keith was the victim of false allegations by disgruntled ex-girlfriends and that he'd been fully cooperative with authorities. The statement made my blood boil because I knew Keith was lying and hiding behind his lawyer. 5 months after my initial FBI meeting, Agent Blackwood called to say they were ready to present their case to a grand jury. They'd gathered sufficient evidence to charge Keith with multiple counts of aggravated assault, strangulation, and sexual assault. They were also charging Voss with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. The indictments would be sealed until arrests were made. She said they'd execute arrest warrants simultaneously for both Keith and Voss in 3 days. She wanted to give me advance warning so I wouldn't be blindsided when news broke. I asked if the case was strong enough to convict, and she said they had 4 victims with consistent testimony, medical evidence, security footage, phone records, and documentation of a pattern spanning 4 years. They had Detective Winters testifying about Voss's obstruction and multiple DA's office employees describing a culture of protecting Keith. The defense would fight hard, but Blackwood believed they'd win. I thanked her and hung up feeling a mixture of relief and dread. My brother was going to be arrested and prosecuted. My family would be destroyed. My parents would be devastated. But Amanda and Alicia and Nina and Simone would finally get justice. The morning of the arrests, I watched from my apartment as news helicopters circled the courthouse where Keith worked. FBI agents walked him out in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions. Keith kept his head down, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale. DA Voss was arrested at his home in front of his wife and teenage children. The footage showed him being led to a federal vehicle while neighbors watched. By noon, every news channel was covering the story. Prominent prosecutor and district attorney charged with assault and corruption. The allegations detailed in the indictment were shocking. Keith's mugshot showed him looking nothing like the confident lawyer who'd sent me dinner invitations. He looked scared and small. My mother called me sobbing, asking if I'd seen the news. I told her I had. She said there must be some mistake, that Keith would never do these things. I stayed silent, and she asked if I knew anything about this. I told her the truth. I'd helped build the case against Keith, because he'd nearly killed his girlfriend, and the DA had covered it up. My mother went quiet. Then she said I'd betrayed my own brother and hung up. My father called an hour later and said I was no longer welcome at family gatherings. My sister sent a text saying I'd destroyed our family for some woman I didn't even know. None of them asked if the allegations were true. They'd decided Keith's innocence based on family loyalty rather than evidence. I'd expected that response, but it still hurt. I'd lost my family by doing the right thing. The trial took place 8 months later. Keith and Voss were tried separately. Keith's trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom watching my brother's defense attorneys try to destroy the credibility of 4 women who'd survived his violence. They portrayed Alicia as vindictive, Nina as unstable, Simone as bitter, and Amanda as confused. They claimed Keith was a dedicated public servant being railroaded by a conspiracy of jealous ex-girlfriends and federal agents looking to make headlines. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard Amanda's 911 call where she named Keith. They saw the security footage showing him leaving her building hours after he'd claimed to leave. They saw the medical photos documenting injuries too severe to be accidental. They heard from the neighbor who'd reported hearing a woman screaming. They heard Detective Winters describe how Voss had ordered her to close the case, despite clear evidence. They heard from 3 other women describing nearly identical patterns of controlling behavior, escalating to physical violence. The defense tried to exclude Winters' testimony, arguing her evidence was obtained illegally. But the prosecution demonstrated they'd independently developed their case through legal channels. Winters' testimony was about Voss's obstruction, not about introducing tainted evidence. The judge allowed it. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Keith guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, strangulation, and sexual assault. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Amanda burst into tears in the courtroom, Melissa holding her while she sobbed. Alicia sat stiff and silent. Nina smiled grimly. Simone left immediately, not wanting to be there when Keith was led away. At sentencing 2 months later, all 4 women gave victim impact statements. Amanda described how Keith had destroyed her sense of safety and forced her to rebuild her entire life. She'd lost her job because she couldn't focus during recovery. She'd suffered permanent cognitive effects from the brain injury. She had PTSD and couldn't be in relationships because she couldn't trust anyone. But she'd survived and found purpose in advocacy work, helping other domestic violence victims. Alicia described how Keith's violence had damaged her ability to trust romantic partners. She'd been in therapy for 3 years, working through the trauma. Nina talked about moving across the country to escape Keith and how his assault had derailed her career. Simone described the shame and powerlessness she'd felt when the DA's office had dismissed her report. She said the system had failed her, but the jury had restored some of her faith in justice. Keith's attorney argued for leniency, claiming Keith had dedicated his life to public service and deserved consideration for his years of prosecuting criminals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The judge sentenced Keith to 26 years in federal prison. He said Keith had used his position of power and knowledge of the legal system to avoid accountability while preying on vulnerable women. That abuse of power warranted a severe sentence. Keith was led away in shackles without looking at anyone. Voss's trial happened 3 months later and resulted in conviction on all corruption charges. He received 12 years for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. His law license was revoked, his pension was stripped, his reputation destroyed. The DA's office underwent a complete overhaul. A special prosecutor was appointed to review every case Keith had worked on and every complaint Voss had dismissed. Dozens of cases were reopened. Several of Keith's convictions were overturned on appeal after defense attorneys argued he'd planted evidence or coerced testimony. The office's credibility was shattered. Amanda wrote a book about her experience that became a bestseller. She donated the proceeds to domestic violence organizations. She'd become a voice for survivors, speaking at conferences, and advocating for legal reforms to prevent prosecutors from investigating their own colleagues. Nina started a support group for women assaulted by law enforcement or legal professionals. Alicia went back to school to become a therapist specializing in trauma. Simone joined the board of a nonprofit pushing for independent oversight of prosecutor misconduct. Detective Winters was reinstated after suing the department for wrongful demotion. She received her full pension and back pay. She retired a year later and now teaches criminal justice ethics at the State University. I testified at both trials about how I discovered Keith's crimes and worked with the FBI. My parents didn't attend. My sister sent me an email saying I was dead to her. My extended family stopped inviting me to holidays. I'd sacrificed my family relationships to stop Keith, and I didn't regret it. Some things were more important than family loyalty. Justice was one of them. 2 years after Keith's conviction, I visited Amanda at her office at the Domestic Violence Advocacy Center she'd founded. She'd decorated the walls with messages from survivors thanking her for giving them courage to come forward. She looked healthy and strong, nothing like the broken woman I'd met in the hospital. She said she'd testified before the state legislature advocating for laws requiring independent investigation of allegations against prosecutors. The legislation had passed. Now every DA's office had to refer complaints against their own staff to an external agency. It was a small change but meaningful. She credited Keith's prosecution with forcing that reform. His crimes had exposed systematic problems that allowed abusers with badges to operate with impunity. We talked about where we'd both been and where we were going. Amanda was engaged to someone she'd met through her advocacy work, someone who'd survived their own trauma and understood hers. She seemed genuinely happy. I'd started dating again too, though explaining my family situation was complicated. Most people understood once I explained why I'd helped prosecute my brother. Some didn't. I'd learned to accept that not everyone would see the choice I'd made as the right one. But I knew I'd done what was necessary. Keith was in prison. Voss was disgraced. 4 women had gotten justice. The system had been forced to change. That mattered more than my family's approval or my own comfort. As I left Amanda's office, I thought about Keith in prison, probably still believing he'd done nothing wrong, that he was the victim of a conspiracy. People who abuse power rarely accept responsibility. They rationalize, deflect, blame their victims. Keith would serve his 26 years and probably never acknowledge the harm he'd caused, but he couldn't hurt anyone else. That was enough. The district attorney had refused to press charges, but justice had found another way. Sometimes the system works despite itself, when enough people refuse to stay silent. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.